let's start by looking at some communication theory. The model that you're looking at the moment is one that you're probably familiar with. It's a pretty commonplace, everyday understanding of how communication works. And if you were a non-media student, this would probably be your dominant understanding of communication. And we refer to it, or the literature refers to it, as a linear model of mass communication, or sometimes a functional model of mass communication. Doesn't really matter what we call it. I tend to call it a linear model because obviously everything's kind of in a straight line, and it makes sense. And the idea of linear communication describes, I think, quite nicely the way the model works. And the model works very simply. You have a message which is created or encoded by someone, i.e. you as a content producer of some sort, and it is sent via electronic means to a receiver, i.e. our audience, who then decodes it or attempts to make sense of it, understand its meaning, if you like. So that's it in kind of a nutshell. You've got a sender, you've got a message, and you've got, sorry about that, you've got a receiver. So sender, message, receiver. Now, a couple of things or a couple of added elements introduce a little bit more complexity. So we've got this idea of a signal and noise. Now, really what noise refers to here or is something that makes the message difficult to understand. Now, that might be physical, that might simply be feedback, electronic feedback that makes a message hard to hear, or something that's not printed very well that makes a message difficult to read. But noise can also refer to something that's more complex than that. So it can refer to more broadly issues which impact upon the successful transmission of the intended meaning which we have here. So for argument's sake, if we take this podcast as an example, noise here might be if I stumble over what it is that I'm saying and you lose your train of thought accordingly, and you can't follow it. Alternatively, imagine if you were in a lecture and listening to this in a conventional lecture theatre, and you really needed to go to the toilet, you really needed to use the bathroom. That is going to distract your attention and make it very difficult for you to understand my intended meaning. And that's one of the beauties of the podcast. If you don't follow what I'm saying, or you need to stop for a moment, you can pause me and come back to me. It might also be in a cross-cultural context. If English is not your first language, then the words that are being used do not necessarily always make sense to you in the natural and quite, uncritical way that a native speaker is able to understand a message. So noise here refers to anything that prevents the message from being understood in the way it's intended. The other aspect of this linear model of communication that is worth focusing on for a minute is this idea of feedback. Now, in media, in mass communication, feedback traditionally has been quite limited. You know, in an analog media world, a world pre-internet, you know, you were limited to letters to the editor, calling into a TV station to complain, or talkback radio where you could call in and express an opinion. Now, of course, the internet, digital media in its broadest sense, makes feedback much more easy to provide. So feedback is the ability of the audience to speak back to the message producer. To give another simple example, in a lecture context, you can raise your hand and ask a question. You can email me and say, Jason, I just didn't understand what it is that you were saying there. Could you explain it to me? And the idea of feedback is that it produces kind of a circular action loop, in that good communication will involve taking audience feedback on board and reframing the message accordingly. So for argument's sake, you might say to me, Jason, I had no idea what it is that you were saying when you were describing the linear model of communication. And I hope that's not true, but maybe that's the case. Then I would re-explain it, and certainly I would re-record this podcast for next semester based on your feedback. So the linear model of communication is pretty simple. We've got a sender who produces a message and an audience, or a decoder or receiver, who interprets the message. Sometimes that message, or the clarity of that message, can be affected by noise, and audiences have the opportunity, through a range of reasonably limited avenues, to provide feedback. So that's the traditional understanding of communication theory. It's kind of an everyday theory, a folk theory. And it's interested in such things as, is your message clear? So are you understanding what it is that I'm saying? Is an advertisement going to want to make you buy the product or the service that is being advertised? Linear models of communication are also interested in how you reduce noise. So how you reduce that, or how you reduce those conflicting messages, or those things that make it difficult to understand the intended message. In other words, how do you structure a message without noise so that the audience understands what it is that you're trying to say? The linear model of communication is also interested in the idea that if your audience doesn't understand your message, why not? You know, what is the nature of the noise? What is the nature of, or what are the nature? No, it should be what is the nature, I apologize, of the conflicting messages that are that are making it difficult for the audience to understand the message. And as a result of that, based on audience feedback, how do you make the message clearer? How do you make the message that you want to convey, whether it be a political speech in the case of someone like Malcolm Turnbull, a PR campaign, a social media campaign, a TV program? How do you make the intended message clearer? So that's what traditional linear models of communication have been interested in, are interested in.